So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this webinar hosted by the Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub. As it is also known, is one of the latest research centers in De La Salle University, Manila, Philippines. And its vision mission is to become a cutting-edge research center and networking hub that addresses regional concerns and serves as a social advocacy arm of De La Salle, Philippines. Our role is to generate Southeast Asian research, collaborate with specialists, network with other centers and institutes of Southeast Asian studies, provide resource materials, and serve as a hub for all matters concerning Southeast Asia. Our event this afternoon is in celebration of Malaysia Day 2020, our small way of showing our solidarity with the people of Malaysia. So to the people of Malaysia, Happy Malaysia Day.
Thank you.
Let me just state that the views expressed in the webinar are those of the speakers and not necessarily of Search. Also, we shall have an open forum after the lecture. Please type your questions in the chat box or in the Q&A box at any time. Now, we have an interesting lecture entitled Decolonizing the Southeast Asian Narrative by Professor Dato Dr. Ahmad Murad Merican of the International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization, ISTAC, of the International Islamic University of Malaysia. Professor Dato Dr. Ahmad Murad Merican heads the Malay-Islamic Civilization Unit at the Institute. He is also visiting professor at the Center for Policy Research and International Studies of the Universiti Sains Malaysia. He was adjunct professor at the National Academy of Arts, Culture and Heritage from 2016 to 2017, and visiting professor at the Faculty of Social and Political Science, Universitas Andalas in West Sumatera in 2006 and 2010. He has published 14 books on intellectual history, media, and social science, and is a columnist for the national daily, the new Straits Times, and the monthly periodical Dewan Masyarakat. His latest books include Atas Angin, a review of the Malay Imagination of Rum, Ferringhi, and Penjajah, published in 2019. Batu Uban, Tanjong and Bagan, Pengkisahan Lisan, 2020, and Decolonizing Penang, the stolen history of a Kedah Island, which is currently in the press. He was a journalist in the early 1980s. So without much further ado, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor to introduce Professor Dato Dr. Ahmad Murad Merican.
Thank you, Fernando. Salam and good afternoon to friends and colleagues. Thank you for the introduction on what I've done and some of my works. In today's session, I'd like to share some of my thoughts on the subject of decolonization in Southeast Asia. The earlier title given to me was the Malaysian experience in decolonizing minds in conjunction with Malaysia Day. First of all, before I continue, today is Malaysia Day, 16th September. It is a result of the coming together of several political units in 1963, Peninsula, Sabah, Sarawak, and Singapore. And Singapore left in 1965. So what we have is Malaysia as a nation state. Before I move on, I'd like to deliberate on some of the thoughts on the issues of South Asian studies. I know some of us have written and spoken about the issue of consciousness of South Asia. Do we think of as Southeast Asians? This is one of the things one of the questions thrown out by one of our colleagues in Singapore. Do we think, are we conscious of ourselves as Southeast Asians? Are we conscious of ourselves as members, as a member of this region? Southeast Asia, as you know, is an invention by the Americans. It was manufactured post World War II, and immediately after that, there are efforts or initiatives at decolonization in terms of giving names to this region. There are several modes of discourse in terms of looking into the context of this region. One is the popular discourse, second is academic, and third is policy or state discourse. These are not mutually exclusive, but they inform one another. And one of the things which I have done is, I think, which Dr. Fernando knows, is in recent years I have been trying to change the consciousness of people in Malaysia with regard to names in certain parts of the country. I have been advocating for a change of name, for reverting of to an earlier name, where Georgetown refers to Tanjong Penaga and Batu reverts to Bagan Tuan Kecil. That is the earlier name, and this has brought in reactions among the establishment and in this part of the world. One of the things that the colonials did is when they came to any part of the world is that they would give new names. And this happened to Columbus, as we know, and to Raffles and to Francis Wright. And when Francis Wright, as recorded, landed on the island of Pulau Pinang, 11th August 1786, he changed two names. One is Georgetown, from Tanjong Penaga to Georgetown, and the other is he attempted to change the island to Prince of Wales Island. It was stillborn, it was not popular, and the name faded away. So these are some of the things which has happened with regard to colonization. And when we study history and society of a place, it is imperative that we also study colonialism, we also study decolonization, and we have to be radical about it, and in terms of how we mitigate and how we overcome history that has been distorted, emotions that has been distorted, identities that has been distorted in the past. And here I would like to refer to a number of examples with regard to Malaysia and the Philippines in terms of names. My approach will be in the nomenclature of the names given to the region before the name of Southeast Asia was given. Southeast Asia was given, one of which is it benefited Southeast Asianists, American scholars who had wanted to study different countries, post-colonial states in South Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, and they have capitalized on events and the processes, historical processes that has happened there. But with regard to Malaysia, I would like to open up the name Malaysia. How did Malaysia came about in terms of its name? That before the nation state of Malaysia. Malaysia literally means islands of Malays, Malaysia, derived from Melayu, the Melayu and the Greek Nessos Islands. It refers to the islands comprising the Malay archipelago. The noun Malaysians and the adjective Malaysian was used in early 1700 in the journal of Peter Flores, who sailed to the archipelago between 1611 and 1615 on the English vessel the Globe. We then see the extensive use of Malaysia in the 19th century. This can be seen, for example, in Malaysia Recorta de Osservazioni Botaniche, a book on botany by Beccari, published in 1877. Another Italian, Emilio Salgari, published a serialized novel called La Tigre della Malaysia, The Tiger of Malaysia, in 1883. It depicts Sandokan, who fought against the British under James Brooke, and several other books published at the time and through the first half of the 1900s also carried the name Malaysia, referring to the region. Earlier names of Malaysia was from the French, the Italian, and the Germans, Malaisie. And we also find the name Malaysia in 19th century English maps, 1850s and so on, that use the word Malaysia for the region. Different from the name Indonesia. Of course, here we have got also to acknowledge that the name Malaysia also may have come from outside. And the name Indonesia, where Indonesia meaning the islands of India, was used in German-speaking world following the ethnographic writings of Adolf Bastian, and later adopted by Hatta and Sukarno. Malaysia is already derived from a local ethnonym. There are two other books carrying the name Malaysia in its title. One is Malaysia, a study in direct and indirect rule, written by American political scientist Rupert Emerson, published in 1937. Was later reissued by University of Malaya Press in 1964. Malaysia, the book, was greeted with hostile criticism from former British members of the Malayan Civil Service, who did not take kindly to Emerson's book. Swettenham, who was governor of the Straits Settlement and High Commissioner of the Federated Malay States, described the title of the book as barbarous. He remarked that it is rather surprising to find that the greater part of this formidable study is occupied with a very detailed account of what has been called the policy of decentralization, a word almost as repellent as Malaysia. This was from Swettenham. Another was in 1945, a book titled The Peoples of Malaysia, authored by Faye Cooper Cole, an anthropologist from the University of Chicago. Cole had worked in Malaya. At the time, he was visiting the Perak Museum Library, and he was particularly interested in the region Malaysia. To him, it comprises the Malay Peninsula, Sumatra, Borneo, and the Philippines. Cole made 4 trips to his Malaysia in 5.5 years and lived in intimate contact with the people he studied. In the peninsula, he spent hours in the library of the museum of in the Perak Museum, which is in Taipei. In a sense, Cole's Malaysia was no different from Rizal's dream of Malaysia. Rizal saw how streams could converge to become a river, how the many could become one. The consciousness of Malaysia, a pluralized entity, a federation of Malay states. One experience, as I've said earlier, was the Malaysia comprising the region and the Malaysia that became a nation state. I will later refer to the Philippines' experience of self-consciousness with regard to returning to their roots. But before that, I'd like to share with you the idea of Malaysia as a nation state. People know that Malaysia was announced by Malaysia's first Prime Minister, Tunku Abdul Rahman, in 1963. But the idea of Malaysia came about from Ghazali Shafi'i. Ghazali Shafi'i was known, his last post was the foreign minister of Malaysia in the early 80s. Ghazali Shafi'i was studying Welsh law in the University of Aberystwyth in Wales in late 1940s. And there he was inspired by the arrangement of states in the United Kingdom, Wales, England, Scotland, an island. And from there, he transposed that arrangement to the region in what we call Southeast Asia, or what we can also call the Malay archipelago or Nusantara. And he saw the peninsula, he saw Borneo, Sabah and North Borneo, Brunei and Singapore as willing candidates to join Malaya as a federation of Malaysia. So the idea of Malaysia as a nation state came from there. But here again, we may refer to this region as the Malay archipelago, and some people call it the Malay world. Malay scholar Ismail Hussein in the 80s came up with a definition of the Malay world, which includes the Malay archipelago. He defined a number of layers referring to the geography of and the history and psyche of this region. One is the core of the Malay archipelago or the Malay world, which is the peninsula, Indonesia, and Singapore. That's the core of the Malay world and the Malay-speaking world. Second layer would be the Malay-speaking world in the archipelago, which stretches from Bergui Tenasserim in Myanmar to the Philippines. These are Malay speakers or speakers of the Malay Polynesian linguistic group, who may be Muslims or who may not be Muslims, who may be Christians, Buddhists, or Hindus. Nevertheless, they fall under the Rukun Melayu. The third layer would be which stretch from Taiwan. In other words, which includes the Malay indigenous groups in Taiwan. And the fourth layer would be the Malay groups from Madagascar to Rapa Nui, Easter Islands, and from Hawaii to New Zealand. So this again is the consciousness by Ismail Hussein, a scholar in Malay studies, to reclaim and to mitigate issues of identity and issues of origins, and making a distinction between the Malay archipelago and the Malay world. And then we have the Philippines. Some of you would be familiar with this, but nevertheless, I'd like to reiterate one early proponent of Malaysia. Early proponent of Malaysia in terms of using the word Malaysia in the context of the consciousness of the peoples in the island that we call the Philippines as a nation state. Jose Rizal, as we know, referring himself as a Malay Tagalog Malay, and Rizal has in his struggle, in his return to his dream, discovered a book that was instrumental in creating this consciousness preceding or at the time, during the time of empire. This was the book that he discovered in London in 1888, titled Successors de las Islas Filipinas by de Morga, Antonio de Morga, a lawyer and official in the Philippines in the 17th century and published in Mexico in 1609. In the book, which I'm trying to get a copyright to translate it into Bahasa Melayu. It is now in Spanish and in English. The monograph gave an idea of the connection between the people of Luzon and the islands and the rest of the Malay archipelago. Based on the book, Rizal and his contemporaries then presented to their countrymen a clear picture of how the Malay Filipinos were beyond the mere and trivial European categorization of Filipinos as Malay. Fernando has presented this in a conference in my university last year. And to me, it was a significant paper in terms of the consciousness coming from the academic level and which informs the popular level. While searching for their roots, the Filipinos discovered their historical and racial ties with the rest of the region and began to consider themselves as belonging to the Malay race. And also there is this realization that of the Hispanization and Christianization of the Filipinos, the legacies of the Spanish colonial order, and further American colonization, which complicated the matrix of the Filipino identity. The Morgas book has certainly brought a different level of a new way of looking at the past, a new way of looking at the unity of the Malay archipelago, which earlier has been separated not only by religion but also by the colonialists. The Spanish had this strategy to isolate Luzon and the Mindanao and the islands from the rest of Muslim Malay archipelago. And also recently we hear from the President of the Philippines, Duterte, to change the name of the Philippines to Maharlika. And this in fact, these are the latest, this is the process that is happening. And what we see is that also in terms of consciousness, the Filipinos were very much earlier in establishing society or an association for the Malays, Persatuan Orang Melayu, which was in the 1930s. Also, as a result of all these developments, that consciousness was resurfaced. The consciousness of using Malaysia resurfaced in the 1930s, and then in the 1960s, when Muhammad Alonto tried to push for the name Malaysia in the Philippine Senate. This was in 1962, but I understand that he passed away in the process. Had it not been that, then the Philippines would have taken the name Malaysia, and Malaysia would have perhaps taken another name. So these are some of the examples of the narrative that has happened in the, what we call South Asia. But still, some would argue that these names are still colonial. Indonesia is very much colonial state. Indonesia, also Malaysia. But then Malaysia has been argued to have its origins in the Melayu, which the word has existed in the Malay literature and so on. So my last point here is that the argument that the terms Southeast Asia and many of these are colonial states, which are imposed by empire. These are true, because our ancestors do not see ourselves in those terms. One of us have said that our ancestors do not see ourselves as east or west or south of any geographical region. And as a teacher for some decades, I teach communication and also political science. I'm always cognizant, I'm always concerned of how to approach and to discuss the society. One would have to start with colonialism. Sadly to say that we start at what we see, but it's important, which I've been doing over the last 30 years, to start with colonialism and to start with and to move on to decolonization. Many may not understand that when we teach the society in South Asia, we're teaching about ourselves, and we have got to delve into ourselves beyond colonial categories, beyond colonial names. We've got to look into, develop a sense of authenticity. We're not saying that we have to go right to the past and to find originality, but there must be some sense of authenticity, some sense of cognizance of how things are distorted. And therefore, whatever subject that we teach, especially in the social sciences and humanities, there has to be this integration, this engagement with epistemology, the epistemology of the subject, the epistemology of the themes of history, of geography, of sociology. Because if we want to generate a clear path to the past, then we need to clearly define the construct of knowledge. We need to clearly deconstruct colonialism. We need to clearly look into how our societies see ourselves and not how others see our society, and from there inform us of what we are. So I thought that Southeast Asia is a very important region, defining the geopolitics of Asia and the world. And therefore, it is important that we know the impact of what colonization has done to us, and both looking at the micro and the macro level. I'm looking at the micro level of what's happening in Malaysia and in Pulau Pinang in terms of reverting to earlier names and looking into the unity of the narrative of polity separated from in different ways, through non-existent treaties, through unequal treaties, and through narratives that imply that the natives do not have a history. And these are things which I'm doing over the last 20 years, and I hope to continue. And this can be extrapolated to other parts of the insular and peninsular region, what we call the Malay Archipelago. So I suppose that's about it in terms of some reflections and thoughts on what we call now Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Now it is time for the open forum, and I invite our audience to write the questions in the chat box. If you wish to speak, then please raise your hand and I can unmute your microphone. We have 2 questions already in the chat box, but before that, well, I'd like to take advantage of my being the host of this program. I hope you don't mind.
Yeah.
Well, in the Philippines, there's a very strong school of thought that decolonialism begins with language. Therefore, if we are to look back on our history and rewrite it, we must rewrite our history using our own language and to remove all of these Western concepts. But then at the same time, this event is possible because both of us speak a common language, and that happens to be the language of the former colonial administrators of both Malaysia and the Philippines. In our case, American English. In their case, British English. So, and that can make it a bit complicated. So, may I know your thoughts on this matter?
Well, in Malaysia, there is not a strong movement to decolonize. One thing I have to say is that in Bahasa Melayu, there is no formal word for decolonization. What we use is decolonisasi. Okay? I've been advocating for another word, which is penjajah. Penjajah is colonialism, and nyah means to do away with. Okay? So again, these are the problems with the definition and the use of the meaning of the word decolonization in Malaysia with regard to Bahasa Melayu. Other than that, there are different strands of resistance among the intellectuals, intelligentsia in Malaysia. Some would be very nationalist in nature. They would want to use Bahasa Melayu in all aspects. They want to argue their point in Bahasa Melayu. The other would be broadly those who would not mind using English, but also to look into aspects of decolonization. But there are very few. Most of those, the group in Malaysia that advocates for decolonizing would be coming from the Malay nationalist group.
Okay. Now we have a question from Nadia Rosiliana Nurdin. So, and the question is, hi Dato, a thought crossed my mind. Could the name Borneo have the corrupted version of Brunei, considering the vastness of the empire it was once before?
I've heard that, yeah. I don't know for sure if it would be the corruption of the word Brunei, but if you look at the Brunei, the geography of Brunei was huge. Brunei covers almost the whole island of what we call Borneo now, and Brunei was not only a tiny nation state, but it would include much of Sarawak, Pontianak, and large swath of Borneo. It could be the case, but I cannot be certain.
Now there is another question from Ruhola Al Husseini Alonto. And the question is, I did not catch well, a part of what you said. Were you referring to Senator Ahmad Dumacao Alonto when you referred to the Philippine Senate vis-a-vis the naming of Malaysia? Thank you.
Yes, I was. Yeah, I was referring to Ahmad Dumacao Alonto when he was advocating for the name Malaysia, the return to consciousness. Nangka Malay, I think. Is that the word? There is a word in the Tagalog, the return to consciousness. So which means freedom. So this would be the spirit in which Alonto, as follower of Rizal and Vinsons, had when they proposed the name Malaysia, and before that, Federation of Union of Malay States, in terms of moving away from the imperialist powers.
Okay. Now, what are your thoughts on uh, the Pan-Malayan movement, a Pan-Malayan movement in 2020?
A pan-Malayan movement 2020.
Yes, sir.
Is that brewing somewhere? Is that brewing somewhere? And yeah.
What are your thoughts on the Pan-Malayan movement, a Pan-Malayan?
Uh, yeah. Uh, Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. There was a disruption here.
I'm so sorry.
There,
My signal was cut.
yeah. There was a disruption. A pan-Malayan movement in the year 2020.
Yes, sir.
Was that the question? Or that's
Yes, sir. Is it feasible, or is it even something that we should be thinking about?
one of the things that uh, our nations in Southeast Asia, our nations in the Malay Archipelago must think about that. We are colonial states. We may sort of politically have been decolonized decades back, but we are still colonial states, and we perhaps may not see ourselves as true nation states. We may not derive our political existence from the nation state of early and modern Europe, where there are certain features, certain characteristics of sovereignty, of government, of population, of a nation. Because what we see are that there's one huge nation having similar characteristics, having broadly coming from one linguistic tree that is broken up into many smaller nations. I was throwing the idea to some people, including the Malaysian Foreign Ministry, to perhaps to at certain levels redefine nations in the Malay Archipelago as civilizational states, not as nation states. In other words, again, this falls back to the larger historical consciousness. This falls back to the overlapping identities and ethnicities. This falls back to the Tanah Air, because when we talk about the Malay Archipelago, one of the things that is a category by itself is the idea of Tanah Air, the homeland of all natives of this region. So the Tanah and the Air has moved about, has played its role in engaging one another. I've discovered, for example, in early records of Manila men sailing from I suppose from Manila to Pulau Pinang in the 1700s. It would be earlier. So there has been a lot of movements within this region, and this region is a region that strives and is conscious of a singular identity. There are multiple ethnicities. I mean, when you talk about the Malay, we're talking about within the archipelago from Sumatra to the Philippines. So there are multiple identities, but perhaps there is a single consciousness, much like the Europeans. You have again even the European, they're conscious of themselves as Europeans. Hence, I don't see the European community having many Brexits in future. There could be nationalist sentiments in different parts, like in the Malay Archipelago. But then historically, there is a certain unity. There's a geographical unity, linguistic unity, and cultural unity. Although we are now in different nation states. So I would not rule out a revival, bearing in mind the earlier, the earlier Filipino. This was in the 1930s, the Union of Malay States. This was and Mafalindo,
Yes.
and that was in the 60s, and ASEAN. But then again, at one level, the consciousness is not only on the Malay archipelago, but on the Malay world. The vast market, if we look at it in economic terms, there's a vast market of perhaps 350 million Malays, stretching from Madagascar to Rapa Nui, to Hawaii, to the Maoris. So again, here we see is that aspiration to have some links. It may not be political links as such, but it may be cultural and perhaps economic links. When we have economic links, when we have a common market, for example, then things can happen. And I think that little investment has been put by the respective nations in the Malay archipelago on this. Perhaps a foreign policy catering to the Malay world, not catering, but with reference to the Malay world as such. And this happens in other parts of the world. We look at, in the Turkish-speaking world, you have a certain preference to that in Turkey and the Straits in Central Asia and so on. And also Europe, of course. Clearly, it is happening in Europe. Why can't it happen in the other domain, in the other geographical domain, which is the Malay archipelago or Nusantara or the other South Asia?
Okay. Thank you, Professor. Here's another question from Jose Victor Torres. What is your opinion on the efforts of decolonization that, although it opens the narrative to scholarship, it causes problems of interpretation and contentions on what is the right interpretation, on what is the right interpretation? Is there a right interpretation?
Yeah. There are many ways to look at it. At times, I get this message of how not to do decolonization, and hence perhaps we need to develop ways on how to do decolonization. But as I've said, the three levels. One is the popular level, the other is the academic level, and the other is a policy or state level, and each informs one another. Example is in Penang, in Pulau Pinang. Pulau Pinang is the earlier name for Penang. Penang is a corruption of the name Pulau Pinang. Pulau Pinang is the most colonized state in Malaysia. They say that the Englishmen founded the use of the word founded Pulau Pinang, and there's a statue of him. And what do we do? Over the recent months, especially during the COVID period, I have gathered some support from some people on a number of things. How to decolonize the narrative by decolonizing the museums, because again, one is the school textbook. That's one. Second is public history, and museums play a part in manifesting public history. So the museums in Pulau Pinang are very colonized. They say that there is a certain date in which the Penang was founded, which is 1786, assuming that before 1786 the island was terra nullius, there was no inhabitants, there was nobody. Therefore, the British has the right to plant their Union Jack and govern the island. So what I did was, first of all, I got copyright to the colonial letters, 1,200 letters. I read all the letters. I found that there was no treaty that says Pulau Penang is to be given to the British. That's one. And then also what to do with Francis Wright. Instead of throwing him into the sea, he should be placed in a diorama in the decolonized museum of Pulau Penang and re-narrated the story. In other words, what we should do, or what we can do, is to re-narrate and to have a clear vision of the past. To re-narrate that, the colonial knowledge is embedded in institutions that we see, that is material or non-material. So we need to re-narrate that, and we need to reconstruct and streamline the narrative. In other words, there would not be any disruption in the past of a certain people or a certain state. So here is not only the museum in Pulau Pinang, but the museums in Malaysia. So the narration, that's why when you give the title, I don't know whether we can decolonize minds. I don't know. It's difficult. There are many resistance, but in some ways, the rewriting of our stories, the appropriation of colonialism must be made public, and this is what we have to do. And to link again, we talk about history books. There may be history books, national history books in Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines, but there are no books that talk about ourselves as a singular group of people in the Malay Archipelago. There are books written by Americans of the history of Indonesia or South Asia, but there are no books written by us. So again, the question is, are natives or citizens of the Malay Archipelago or Nusantara better writers or better observers of our own history? Again, that's the question also we have to ask. But what's important here is that narration be done critically. Again, perhaps also this could be the time to create a field, critical studies on the Malay Archipelago, or critical history of the Malay Archipelago. Critical here, I'm looking at the West too. I'm looking at the critical school, Frankfurt School in the 1920s with a capital C. So critical here means being alert and having a questioning mind of the institutions of colonialism, because colonialism, as we know, is an institution that does not do justice. That has vandalized our identity and our ethnicity. So again, we need to be alert and to be critical of that. Here I'm talking about European colonialism. There are many other forms of colonialism, also the Japanese.
Yeah. Okay, Professor, thank you. We have some very difficult questions in the chat box. And one of them comes from Nia Deliana, I presume from Indonesia. So the question is, consciousness of identity is increasingly discussed in numerous spheres nowadays and highly conflicted with the current nation state regimes, let's say Indonesia, where economic and political administration as well as laws are still very much inheritance of colonial legacy, sustained by pro-colonial systemic machine. So how do you suggest decolonialism of Indonesia?
Indonesia is a very colonial nation. Not much discourse has come out from Indonesia in terms of in the social sciences, in history, looking at a decolonized history of Indonesia. Not much. I mean, I'm looking at Sojok Moko, in the 60s or 70s. But after him, there are various strands, but this has not institutionalized. Indonesia even takes its name from a suggestion from a European scholar and from European experiences. Indonesia or Indonesia, which refers to islands of course, islands of India. Indonesia, Nesos means islands. So where Indonesia has a different, perhaps compared to other states in the Malay archipelago, have a very different state consciousness. They are much institutionalized, and the level of nationalism is perhaps higher. I'm making a judgment here. Is perhaps higher, so much so that Indonesia sees itself as the big brother of the whole archipelago, including that of the Philippines. Of course, Malaysia, we know confrontasi is an experience that we had. So again, Indonesia must produce scholars. Indonesia must Indonesia must deconstruct the state. No state comes from heaven. We are all colonial states. We are all manufactured somewhere. So again, but then Indonesia, Sukarno in his foresightedness, established Bahasa Indonesia, which is based on Bahasa Melayu. Why not Bahasa Jawa or other language Indonesia? But establishing Bahasa Indonesia from Bahasa Melayu. So there is one positive development, I would say, in terms of generating that say a pan-Malayan, as you said, perhaps. But yeah, I mean, to go back to Delana, it's quite difficult to decolonize Indonesia unless that Indonesia sees itself as a brother nation of other Malay archipelago nations.
Okay. The next question is from Kim Miranda. Doctor, is it possible for East Asia to decolonize, knowing that the major powers in the world are trying to compete with one another in terms of Southeast Asia's resources?
Can you repeat your question? There was some, yeah.
Is it possible for Southeast Asia to decolonize, knowing that the major powers in the world are trying to compete with each other in terms of Southeast Asia's resources?
There are several levels here. With regard to the narrative, with regard to commonality in literature, in our central cultural characteristics, in the linguistic group, I suppose that, and also in the teaching of the universities, in how our universities would have to look at ourselves. In other words, looking at ourselves endogenously, not from outside, but from within. This is possible. There would be a network of universities, perhaps, or at school level. And one of the things that has happened, I think, over the last perhaps about 20 or 15 years back, is an attempt to create a common history curriculum among Southeast Asian nation schools. There was a study done by University of Malaysia. I think this was in 2005, or that's 15 years back, and to see how the history curricula in the schools in Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, so on, would be common. So that could be a start. I mean, I've looked into, I've not seen the Philippines school book, but I've seen Indonesian school books and Malaysian school textbooks, history textbooks. They're different. The idea of empire is different. The idea of the polities are different. And historically, how one polity or empire overlaps into the national territory. The idea of differences in territorial integrity are also different. So this could be resolved, perhaps with a common school system where the history curriculum is concerned, and then also the universities. Politically, yeah, I mean, we cannot deny the foreign powers. We cannot deny Europe, China. We cannot deny the US. But then, if we come together as a bloc and engaging ourselves collectively, then this could happen. But see, where geopolitics is concerned, we are cognizant of the superpowers, and they'll be there for some time. Europe and America, and now China and India. But China and India would be perhaps present a different scenario than the Euro-American powers. But as a collectivity, there is much potential for us to do. There is much networking where our foreign ministries are concerned, meaning to say that that dimension of policy catering for our affinities, the Malay archipelago, the Malay world as such, and that can be done.
We actually have a lot more questions in the chat and in the Q&A, but circumstances don't permit me to ask all of them anymore. Okay. I think we have time for around 2 more questions. So, and some of the other questions have been addressed anyway. But there is a narrative that Southeast Asia is a product of colonialism. So, given that narrative, is it possible to truly, fully decolonize Southeast Asia? Or should that narrative be perceived as not entirely a bad thing? So I think you talked about this earlier.
Yeah. Yes, South Asia has been exposed to the different European powers, from the Portuguese to the Spanish, and over the last 500 years, things have been institutionalized in many ways. We are only, white people in the brown mask. Essentially, our spirit is European. We dream the colonizers' dream. We speak their language. We subscribe to their institutions. But could there been another way of looking at things, or of progressing ourselves without them? There would be. Thailand is an example. Japan is another example. So what we're saying is, it's not to go back and to what is the measure of authenticity? What is the measure of originality? We don't know. Okay? Is it before the Spanish came, or is it based on the De Morga's book? What was the measure of Malayness for Rizal is based on that book, published, written in the 1400. The 1400 was De Morga's description of the Malay archipelago. So again, we as subjects and objects, we need to see that things evolve and things interact. They inform one another. But what is important here is not to allow domination. When the colonials came, we in the Malay archipelago have coexisted for centuries. There was no monopoly. Let's put it that way. When the Portuguese came, they broke everything. When the Spanish came, they broke everything. There was no monopoly. There was coexistence. So what we need to aspire for is coexistence with regard to our daily life and our state level policies, and to return not to return to the primordial self, but to return to a certain time in which we thought that that this represents ourselves. This represents our collective memory, because we all have a collective memory. We all have a collective history in this part of the world, and it's that collective memory that has to be the point in which we raise ourselves. We cannot move away from say, I can't move away from English. I was educated in the colonial school, the first school in Southeast Asia. So I can't move away from certain works in English. There's a certain appreciation. Even again here, we need to make a distinction between indigenization, decolonization, and alternative forms of knowledge, or endogenization, or nativism. So these are things that I think we need to, as scholars, and also for the layman, we need to inform that there are distinctions to it. Some people advocate for indigenization of knowledge, which may not necessarily be the appropriate form after decolonization. So because when we decolonize, we have to fill up our space with another form of knowledge. What is that knowledge? So it is up to us to define ourselves with regard to that level of authenticity of the region.
Okay. So the last one is a comment from Professor Farish Noor.
Yeah.
So Professor Murad's point about history books is very important. One of the odd things about post-colonial Southeast Asia is how all the countries of the region have produced national histories, but not a common regional history. There's no common history textbook on Southeast Asia in our part of the world. It is therefore not surprising that the people of the region do not know each other, do not know one another, as we do not think or learn of ourselves as members of a regional family.
Yes.
So your
Thank
thoughts,
you.
sir?
Thank you, Dr. Farish. Thank you. Yeah, he's right. As I've said, we had a collective geography, a collective history, a collective memory, but we have separate histories, and these separate histories is kind of competing and also a contradiction. We contradict one another. For example, if in Malaysian school textbooks, we only know that Malacca is the greatest port in South Asia, but there are other port cities and other ports in Thailand, in Indonesia, and the Philippines that are of equal importance. So again, a common history and to transcend national histories. In other words, for us to know our nation, for us to know our country, our nation state, we have to know the regional history. We have to know regional history. So again, the many histories will fall back to one singular history. There has to be a common history, and this has to start from schools, a common textbook, and this has to move on to the universities and public history. So the citizen of in the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia must have a common history. So again, we have to see ourselves as not as natives of the Malay Archipelago, but in the modern sense as citizens of the Malay Archipelago, having broad common institutions and affiliations.
Okay. So Professor Murad, it's really an honor to have you join us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your time, your expertise, and your insights. This has been a very interesting discussion, and I hope that sometime in the future we can have another discussion about this topic. Decolonization is truly a regional concern, a concern among not the politicians, I presume, but more the concern of intellectuals and ordinary people, laymen, as you said.
Yes.
So again, thank you very much.
Thank you so
And
much, Fernando. Yeah. Thank you.
On behalf of the Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub, I'd like to thank our audience for joining us this afternoon. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, and I hope you can join us in our next webinar.
Thank you. My pleasure.